Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. When last we left our humble explorers, I talked about how I went wandering through the AI vendor landscape and came back with a different conclusion than the one I expected. I mean, I thought I was studying products, but what I felt like I ended up studying was decision making. Now, that earlier episode focused on how identity platforms, risk engines, policy tools, those kinds of things, all present themselves as separate categories. Yet when you look more closely, they are often participating in the same larger outcome. And today I want to take that idea a little step further because I think there's more useful framing hiding in here somewhere. And that's that the, identity systems do not make decisions, at least not by themselves. It's a whole thing. It's a whole environment, more like a federated decision-making process. And that doesn't always work like we hope it will, especially when you add probabilistic AI systems to the mix. I mean, if you spend enough time around identity and security teams, there's some common patterns in how the people will be talking about the tools that they use, right? They will say that the identity provider allows the login, the fraud engine blocks the transaction, the policy engine required the step-up authentication, or the device platform denied access. And that's actually a shorthand, which is entirely understandable. It's very efficient, and most of us knows exactly what that means. But I think it hides something important, and that's that most of those systems are not making the full business decision anyone actually cares about. They are contributing inputs, evaluating conditions within a narrow scope, and returning outputs according to the logic that they were given. And this is very useful and necessary work, but it is not the same thing as deciding whether this user, this moment, under these conditions should be trusted to do this specific thing. That broader outcome is usually assembled across multiple systems, multiple teams, and multiple assumptions, which means the real decision often lives nowhere in particular, which should make you a little bit uncomfortable. Now, if you look at a vendor diagram or even standards documentation, you're going to be shown a very clean and tidy world. There's a directory over here, there's authentication over there, policy is of course in the center, risk scoring is off to one side, enforcement neatly connected by very well-defined interfaces. Everything is modular, rational, and under control. It is a lovely world. I'm not sure whose world it is, but it is in fact lovely. Real enterprises tend to be a bit messier. One platform came in from an acquisition. One tool was deployed after an audit finding. One rules engine was customized years ago by someone who has since moved on. One application does its own authorization because nobody could wait for the central team to do it. One critical integration is maintained partly through scripts and partly through thoughts and prayers. And yet from the outside, it can still look like a coherent identity architecture. Operational success can hide structural confusion for quite some time. The actual business outcomes emerges from how the pieces are combined. If you want to understand the decision, you can't actually stop at any one product boundary, at least until you add AI without thinking through how decisions are actually made. That's where it gets really interesting. Let's take an example. A user's logging in from a managed laptop while traveling. The identity provider sees valid credentials and a strong authentication. The device tool says the endpoint is healthy. The risk service notices an unfamiliar geography. The policy engine checks whether travel from that region required additional verification. The application has its own exception logic for executives, because they are special snowflakes. Customer support previously added temporary bypass for this user that may or may not expire tomorrow. Every individual step may be functioning exactly as designed. And yet, sometimes you throw AI into the mix and the final outcome may be inconsistent or surprising or hard to explain. Each system is evaluating reality through its own model. Each one has its own thresholds, its own data freshness, its own assumptions, ownership, and fallback behaviors. And internally, they're going to be very deterministic, but collectively, maybe not. So I do want to be careful here because people sometimes hear criticism and assume that the claim is that identity systems are random or unreliable. That is not actually what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that most enterprise systems are designed to be deterministic. Given the same inputs and configurations, they should behave predictably. That's a very good thing. It's how you audit controls, test changes, and build trust in operations. The problem is not that the new parts people are adding in, it's that those are non-deterministic. That's an issue. Problem is that decision spans many deterministic parts and do not always share the same meaning, which when you put it into a probabilistic system gets really awkward. So ultimately, answers will depend on who's consuming data, where it's consumed, and under what assumptions. And that's actually like a semantics problem masquerading as an integration problem, which enterprises are just full of that. Now, when something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, organizations often rely on their logs. They'll reconstruct the incident, trace the request, see what happened, and that approach absolutely has value, and sometimes it's essential. But reconstruction after the fact is not the same as having a decision model. If 5 systems can each explain their local behavior, you may not have a clean explanation of the overall outcome. What you have instead are fragments, timestamps, clues, 3 dashboards, 2 exports, and someone quietly saying, that's odd. What you do not have is a clear representation of what inputs mattered, what inputs were ignored, what policy logic actually applied, which fallback mode was active, or why one signal overrode another. And that gap becomes pretty painful during audits or incidents or customer escalations or executive briefings, especially executive briefings. So this is where that previous episode connects directly to this one. These cracks existed before AI, but humans often just absorbed them, right? Support teams made judgment calls, analysts investigated anomalies, administrators granted exceptions. Engineers patched around the inconsistencies, which is all fairly messy, but it was survivable. AI is changing the tolerance level. If a model is recommending actions, scoring users, triaging incidents, or operating as an agent, then the surrounding decision environment needs much clearer boundaries, not more, vague ones. You need to know what the model's output means. You need to know how much authority it has. You need to know which controls can override it. You need to know who is accountable when it gets things wrong. And you need enough consistency in all of that the system can be reasoned about. It's basic operational hygiene. If your environment cannot explain how decisions are made today, layering AI on top will simply automate confusion faster. I mean, that's what AI is really good at. It's good at making things go faster. Good decisions, bad decisions, all of it. Okay, so what's a better starting point? Well, in my view, it begins with take one critical decision. Not the tools, not the architecture slide, not the vendor roadmap. Pick one decision that matters to your organization. That decision might be access to payroll or approval of wire transfer, administrative access to production. Kind of doesn't matter for the sake of this exercise. Then ask what information is required to make that decision correctly. Which systems provide the information? Where is meaning translated from? Where do the defaults apply? Where are the exceptions that can be introduced? Who owns the outcome? And how is the rationale overall captured? Right? If you can get through all of those questions usually reveal reality much faster than asking whether the IAM platform is modern and uses AI. A surprising amount of modernization is really kind of cosmetic. Decision quality is much harder to fake, really. So I think more of the industry is going to move in the direction of treating decisions as discrete artifacts over time. You can already see hints of it in cryptographically bound approvals, transaction-specific authorization artifacts, and context-rich attestations tied to a moment in time. These approaches are interesting because they start treating the decisions as something concrete rather than a side effect of multiple systems interacting at runtime. Right? They create artifacts that can be inspected, verified, and reasoned about, which isn't going to eliminate distributed architectures, nor should it. Large enterprises are going to remain heterogeneous for the foreseeable future, probably forever, and different business units or legacy platforms or regulatory constraints are not going to go anywhere. But if distributed decisions is inevitable, then you actually have to think about how to make them coherent. You have to design it. It's not just going to happen. So what changes when you actually take all of this really seriously? Once a team adopts a decision-centric view, I expect the conversations between the different silos of fraud and IAM and cybersecurity and whatever, your business logic, your HR, I suspect the conversations will improve. Instead of arguing over which product owns the issue, people will hopefully start asking whether the outcome is correct. And instead of whether debating if a signal is technically available, they'll talk about whether the signal is actually meaningful. Success is not going to be uptime or logging completion rates. It's going to be whether the decisions were consistent and defensible. It's actually, I think, a much healthier and more honest place to operate. The complexity that you have is not going to disappear when you ignore it, right? It's just going to become someone else's incident later. So if you missed the homework from last time, I'm actually going to repeat it a little bit, right? If you want to pressure test your own architecture, try a simple to explain exercise, possibly not easy to do. Take one sensitive decision path in your organization and ask 3 people from different teams to explain how that decision is made, right? Ask someone from security, ask someone from identity, ask the application owners. If you receive 3 incompatible answers, you have learned something very useful. If you receive 1 vague answer and 2 shrugs, you've probably learned something even more useful. And if everyone says it depends, well, yes, it does. That's actually kind of the point. I think identity professionals are entering a phase where component thinking is no longer enough. We still need standards. We still need better tools. We still need vendors doing some real work here. But we also need clearer thinking about the decisions themselves, their semantics, their evidence, their accountability, and their portability across systems. Because the identity systems don't make the decision. It's the whole IT environment, the entire infrastructure, the architecture of your company's digital world. And if no one explicitly designed the decision model, then the model you have is probably accidental, which is not a great place to be. So your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to pick one important decision in your environment and trace how it's actually made. Not how the diagram says it's supposed to work, but how it actually works, because there's usually a pretty interesting story there. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.